Well, first of all, I have a handout, so thanks. Appreciate it. Okay.
Give us handouts also.
Thanks, Gershon, for revealing my document. But quick point. First of all, I'd like to thank Chief for inviting me for this wonderful conference. I must admit, I'm not very professional and medicine scholar. I got a little bit more and more into that recently. My area usually is Spinoza, early modern philosophy, German idealism. My hero is Maimon, but I'm interested in Mendelssohn in the context of the development of modern Judaism, or more specifically, what I would call Jewish Protestantism. This is basically going precisely on my path, and that's why I was very happy to jump in. Okay, so the title of the talk is Mendelssohn, Maimon, and Spinoza on excommunication and toleration, dispelling 3 convenient myths. The last myth, I probably won't have much time. I'll try to summarize it briefly, but I see if I go beyond 20 minutes, just let me know, because then I'll just try to summarize the last myth. Okay, Moses Mendelssohn received the Torah of the Aufklärung in Berlin and delivered it to the elders of his circle. His circle delivered it to their children, and those went to the magnificent building called Kirche, in which some of the most impressive theological political miracles of our day took place. They entered qua Abrahams, Yitzhaks, and Yaakov, and in a short time they poured out Hans, Fritz, and Gerhards. Ilule de Misafina, I would say, Mikveh Yisrael Hashem, 2,000 years of rabbis were not as successful as this brief baptism in turning these hard-necked people into lamb-like believers in the most absurd and ridiculous religious myth. Some of the Fritz decided to found a Jüdische Kirche, others spread the new religion of the Aufklärung to Poland. And thus even the barbaric Ostjuden came under the holy wings of the Jüdische Kirche. This is briefly the genealogy of Jewish Protestantism, sive modern Judaism. Today, more than 2 centuries after the new revelation in Berlin, it is hard to deny that we are all students of Moses Mendelssohn. Jewish Protestantism became the default notion of Judaism. Zionists, Mizrochnikers, conservative, Reform, and modern Orthodox, we are all Protestant Jews. We study the Bible, whatever study in this context they mean. We listen to sermons. We practice religion, whatever that notion means. And above all, we hate the Pharisees. Truth be told, we must admit that even they, the old Pharisees, became a bit like us. Indeed, ours is the Jewish world. Blessed is God, the Mother and the Son. What's more, we gain the world by right and not by might, for we are, were, and will ever be the only true forces of tolerance and light among the Jews. Tolerance plays a crucial role in the ideology and self-perception of the Jewish Enlightenment. Tolerance is what distinguishes the modern Jew from the dark shadows in the old synagogue. And tolerance is what the modern Jew besieged in his catastrophic failed attempt to enter Sikh society in modern Europe. In this context, tolerance has another idiosyncratic sense. The modern tolerant Jew could indeed uproot entire people from their land without compromising his pure and tolerant conscience. When those poor souls ask to return to their own homes, we portray them as intolerant fanatics. Since tolerance has such a crucial role in the history and self-perception of the modern Jew, in what the Europeans did to him and in what he did to the people of Palestine, it is truly urgent to trace the origin and meaning of this notion in the Jewish context. Moses Mendelssohn is commonly described by his friends and admirers as a paradigm of a tolerant person. It is likely that some of these tales are hagiographic, But as far as I can tell, the historical evidence we have portray him as a decent, non-arrogant person who was open to critique and willing to engage in attentive dialogue with his opponents. Though it is hard to distinguish Mendelssohn's demand from his views, my attempt here will be to scrutinize Mendelssohn's notion or understanding of tolerance, and particularly his objection to the use of cherem, or excommunication, against dissenters within the Jewish community. The common Maskilic narrative of the story runs roughly along these lines. Mendelssohn had an unrestricted commitment to tolerance, that's almost a quote from Altman's introduction to Jerusalem. Mendelssohn was opposed to the use of this forceful communal tool named cherem on grounds that this use would display intolerance towards a member of the community. In this context, Mendelssohn's objection to excommunication is frequently discussed in the context of another event, perhaps even as a lesson from that event, the excommunication of Spinoza. In this paper, I will argue that this self-flattering narrative is based on several myths. Let's begin with the earliest one. The Portuguese Jewish community of Amsterdam announced a cherem on Benedict de Spinoza on July 27, 1656. This event plays an important role in the perception of Judaism actually it's 18th century European culture, and is commonly seen as a shining evidence to the intolerant nature of Judaism. There are many legends and wild speculations surrounding the excommunication of Spinoza, and we do not have here the time to try and sieve the truth from the imaginary. My aim here is rather limited. All I wish to know is whether, for Spinoza, excommunication was indeed an improper tool that should not be used by religious communities. In Spinoza's writings, we do not have any record of his response to the cherem. Yet, in his 1670 theological political treatise, Spinoza addresses explicitly the issue of excommunication. Chapter 19 of the TTP, of the Theological Political Treatise, Spinoza develops his claim that the supreme authority in matters of religion belongs squarely to the political sovereign. In this context, he writes, I read, you have the quote, "No one has the right or the power without the authority or consent of the sovereign to administrate sacred matters or choose ministers or decide to establish the foundation and doctrine of a church, nor may they without that consent give judgments about morality and observance of piety, or excommunicate or receive anyone into the church or care for the poor." Okay? So that's a long list of things that you must get permission from the sovereign in order to do them. Notice that in this passage, Spinoza lists excommunication or excommunicating among the legitimate and common functions of the church, alongside almsgiving and establishing doctrines of faith. Spinoza stipulates that all functions of religion should be supervised by the state, but he does not have any in-principle objection to the use of excommunication. On the contrary, he seems to treat it just as any other legitimate function of the church. Thus, contrary to the common assumed belief, Spinoza was not at all opposed to the use of excommunication. Let me also note that in 1639, Spinoza's community, the Portuguese community, Jewish community in Amsterdam, was explicitly authorized by the city of Amsterdam to excommunicate. And this authorization was renewed in 1670. Thus, it seems that from Spinoza's own point of view, there was nothing formally improper with his excommunication. That was the first myth. In his 1792 Lebensgeschichte, a few years after Mendelssohn's death, Solomon Maimon writes, I read it, it's a long quote, but Mendelssohn wanted to cancel the excommunication on the ground that the church has no right in civil matters. But how can he then maintain the perpetuity of the Jewish ecclesiastical state? For what is a state without right, and wherein consists, according to Mendelssohn, the right of his ecclesiastical state? How, says Mendelssohn in the preface to Menashe ben Israel, can a state allow one of its useful and respected citizens to suffer misfortune through its laws? Surely not, I replied. But the humble Jew suffers no misfortune by virtue of the excommunication. He required only to say or do nothing which legally leads to this result, and he would then avoid the sentence. For excommunication is merely tantamount to saying, so long as you put yourself in opposition to the laws of our communion, you are excluded from it. And you must therefore make up your mind whether this open disobedience or the privileges of our communion can most advance your blessedness. This surely cannot have escaped a mind like Mendelssohn. I'm still reading from a mind like Mendelssohn. And I leave it to others to decide how far a man may be inconsistent for the sake of human welfare. End of quote. What was precisely the inconsistency in Mendelssohn's position? Let us briefly provide the historical background. In his preface to the 1782 edition of Menashe ben Israel Vindicare Judaeon, as well as in Jerusalem, Mendelssohn argued that against granting Jewish communities the right to excommunicate members who did not adhere to their regulations. The local context was a ban announced in Altona against a member of the Jewish community who shaved his beard and started wearing a decorated wig. Mendelssohn's writing was also partly in response to Christian Wilhelm Dom's 1781 tract on the civil improvement of the Jews, in which Dom advocated for the admission of Jews into German society, since, I quote, it's a nice sentence, the Jew is more a man than a Jew. Okay? Keep that in mind, the Jew is more a man than a Jew. Right? I mean, it's a key sentence also for the Jewish Enlightenment of the 19th century. Some of you remember, yeah, you give all Adam right? Anyway, so that's a very interesting expression of the ideology of the Enlightenment. We'll see some of that later. Now, Dom suggested various measures to improve the Jews, but he argued that Jews should retain their religious communal autonomy through religious courts, and like any other religious community, should have the right to communicate in order to retain the authority of the community. Mendelssohn explicitly disagreed with Dom and argued that religious communities should not be allowed to excommunicate its members. Why did Maimon criticize Mendelssohn's views as inconsistent and disingenuous? Mendelssohn begins his discussion of excommunication in Jerusalem with a majestic announcement, very impressive announcement. So he replies, I don't have it, but it's quick, it's short. Neither church nor state has a right to subject men's principles and convictions to any coercion whatsoever. It's a very general and strong. In a minute, we'll see that it's going to be very, very limited. However, shortly afterwards, he admits that, I quote, the state may occasionally permit itself to exercise excommunication and the right to banish. It's just 2 pages afterwards. Specifically, Mendelssohn suggests, I read, the state should see from afar that no doctrines are propagated which are inconsistent with the public welfare. Doctrines which, like atheism and Epicureanism, undermine the foundation of which the felicity of social life is based. Let Plutarch and Bale inquire ever so much whether a state might not be better off with atheism than with superstition. Let them count and compare ever so much the afflictions which have hitherto befell the human race from these sources of misery. Civil society would do well to let neither of them, neither fanaticism nor atheism, take root and spread. End of quote. Mendelssohn is even willing to point out the precise doctrines which the state should preserve and actually insist on enforcing them. So here, the state should not trouble itself with all the principles which a dominant or merely tolerant faith. Pay attention, there is a dominant against tolerant. Tolerant is basically, you have central, and what is tolerated is just a marginal religion against the dominant. So it should not engage with the principles of dominant or merely tolerant faith may adopt or reject. It is a question only of those fundamental principles on which all religion agree and without which felicity is but a dream.
and virtue itself ceases to be a virtue without God, providence, and future life. Okay? 3 principles. If you play this game, you are in. If you're not, you are in trouble. Mendelssohn's lofty, enlightened rhetoric impressed many readers, but Maimon was clearly not one of them. What were precisely the boundaries of what could and could not be tolerated for Mendelssohn? At times, it seems as if Mendelssohn suggests that it is only actions and not beliefs that are subject to the state's intervention. And that would be actually quite legitimate. However, as we have just seen, Mendelssohn thinks that the state should interfere and uproot certain beliefs, okay? Not only actions. Furthermore, the Altona ban was not about beliefs, right? The case there was about wearing a wig. That's an act. But rather about actions and social practice, wearing a wig, shaving a beard, and etc. So it seems that on some issues, Mendelssohn was defending the rights of dissenters to follow an antagonistic practice, while on other issues, he was not allowing dissenters to have problematic beliefs. Furthermore, it is true that the belief in God, providence, and future life was shared by both the Christian and Jewish bourgeoisie, but Maimon, unfortunately, was not part of the holy community of the bourgeoisie. In fact, we can easily imagine Maimon reading the above passages in Jerusalem, saying to himself that Mendelssohn would even attempt to uproot the philosophical views of the Rambam, right? I mean, ask cheap. I mean, does the Rambam believe in future life or in providence? I don't know. I think most likely the answer is no. So according to the Mendelssohnian notion of tolerance, the state should watch him, right? Because he is dangerous. Now, and so say just in fact, we can easily imagine Maimon reading the above passages in Jerusalem and saying to himself that Mendelssohn would even attempt to uproot the philosophical views of Maimonides insofar as those, as Maimonides clearly knew, do not really assert the great bourgeois principles of God, providence, and future life. Indeed, Maimon himself has experienced this notion of Mendelssohnian tolerance when in 1781 Mendelssohn asked Maimon to come to see him after hearing that Maimon behaved like an Epicurean and was spreading the pernicious opinions of Spinoza. Upon hearing Maimon's own admission, Mendelssohn made him understand that he should quit Berlin. Thus, Maimon rightly concluded that Mendelssohnian toleration was of a very particular kind. It was not an in-principle defense of pluralism, but rather a straight partisan attempt to secure the place of the useful and respected rich Jews among the German bourgeoisie, whose maxim was simple and candid. You are allowed to think and practice whatever religious belief or customs a decent, useful, and respected German Bürger commonly practice. Or in other words, you are allowed to be like us. What a wonderful notion of tolerance. I'm 5 minutes, okay. So if you want to enjoy another notion of tolerance, you can just look at the quote from, it's a beautiful letter from Mendelssohn to Jacob Emden, where in 1766, Mendelssohn praising Emden for persecuting the Sabbateans. Now, of course, persecuting the Sabbateans is fine, I mean, because they are fanatics. The wording is amazing. He's just so enthusiastic about how he's praising Emden for crashing and beating and doing whatever you can just to a kind of a very violent rhetoric. So I don't know, perhaps that might be also another notion of tolerance. But I have 3 minutes, so let me say what was more important for me. I think that the third myth is actually the myth about tolerance itself. I think that the notion, I'm not the first to say that, but I think the notion of tolerance is a very poor notion. We tolerate cockroaches and parasites. Human beings deserve more. Toleration is nothing over and above the willingness not to exterminate or expel the other. basically you can think about three possible reactions to the other. You can see him as equal and say there is a plurality of centers. You can exterminate the other, or you can say I'm willing to tolerate, I don't like you, but I'm willing to tolerate you. Toleration is actually is a very old model. It's the old Augustinian model in which you are saying, I cannot stand the Jews, but I'm going to keep them there. They are actually also helpful because they are going to attest to the glory of my success, right? I mean, they will be, their inferior existence will attest to my greater success. I don't see any kind of the greatness of this notion of tolerance. So what is the alternative? The alternative is something like cultural equality and multiplicity of centers. And Mendelssohn was, in that sense, part of the Enlightenment, and he could not advocate that because Mendelssohn believed, as part of the Enlightenment, believed in the hierarchy of cultures. I mean, you have Bildung. Once you have the Bildung, your culture relates differently to other cultures. So the whole notion of a plurality of centers in which you are not patronizing, you are not looking at other culture, and in Mendelssohn's case, you are not looking at your own culture as inferior, is simply not there. Once you have this hierarchy of culture, the highest culture could at best, and that's really the level, it can tolerate the inferior culture, and when it doesn't work, it will exterminate the inferior culture. But that's basically the logical space of this notion. Now, in that sense, I think the toleration is the complementary, it plays a complementary logic of cultural hierarchies and racism. I mean, you tolerate what you don't want to go and exterminate, but also what you are not willing to recognize is equal to you. Last word, I mean, I'm going to respond to, not respond, but basically, Micha is making a very beautiful point in the preface to his book, saying that Mendelssohn, till 9/11, Mendelssohn was not considered to be, there was no atmosphere in the US that was hospitable to the reception of Mendelssohn. Why? Because Mendelssohn was considered to be as part of the Enlightenment, colonialism, and once 9/11 happened, once we have the whole notion of clashes of civilization, all these kind of stuff, suddenly we are more open to embracing Mendelssohn. Now, on my side, all I can say is bet for Mendelssohn, right? If in order to embrace him, what we need is this kind of emergence of Islamophobia in Europe and the emergence of the darkest elements of enlightenment that we faced in the past 10 years.